Racist woman built 96 luxury homes, illegally, right on Big Shaq's land, thinking no one would notice. But the ground remembers what the records tried to erase, what racist woman didn't know. The Attorney General is Big Shaq's friend. Now every brick is shaking, and the reckoning is federal. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The road to the property was thinner than Shaq remembered. Or maybe the trees had simply grown closer over the years, leaning in like they wanted to whisper something. He hadn't been back to this part of Georgia since his uncle passed, and truthfully he hadn't planned to come now, but a letter had found its way to him. No return address, just a single line inside. Check the north field. They've taken it. He arrived mid-morning, alone, in a rental SUV that still smelled like plastic. The gravel road crunched beneath the tires as he turned onto the old access path his uncle used to call the spine. But as the trees opened, the view hit him like a blow that didn't leave bruises. It just burned. Where there should have been open land, knee-high brush and remnants of the rusted irrigation lines, there were homes. Rows of pristine, polished copy-paste homes. Cream siding, black shutters, red front doors. Each had manicured lawns that hadn't seen more than a month of growth, and driveways that gleamed like someone had polished them twice a day. There were 96 of them. Identical. Surgical. Too clean for southern dirt. Shaq stepped out of the truck without shutting the door. The quiet was artificial. Curated. The kind of quiet that came with HOA fees and noise ordinances. And just beneath it was something colder. Absence. He scanned the porches, the sidewalks, the parked cars. There were children's toys, lawn flags, wind chimes, but not a single black face. Not one. And this wasn't a coincidence. It was design. He moved toward the fence line, tall, aluminum, newly installed, and spotted the wooden boundary marker from his uncle's deed, still embedded in the ground, half swallowed by grass. His boots stopped right next to it. He crouched. The fence ran directly through it. He looked up. The fence wasn't just cutting through his land. It was claiming it. He didn't rage. He didn't storm the leasing office or post an outraged video. Instead, he walked back to the truck, opened the back seat, and pulled out the flat black case he'd brought, mostly out of curiosity. Inside it, a drone. He calibrated it, launched it, and watched through the tablet as the device climbed upward, stabilizing over the property like a ghost above a grave. From the sky, the grid was even more precise, a development surgically imposed on old land. But as he panned the drone camera over the northern fence line, he caught something the developers probably hadn't noticed, or didn't care to check. The old tree-lined twisted oaks with scars in their trunks still ran in a half-arc that had once formed the north perimeter of his uncle's property. His uncle had told him stories about those trees, how his great-grandfather had planted them to mark the land. After buying it with pooled money from freedmen families in 1904, they'd been ignored by surveyors, neglected by tax maps, but not forgotten by the root. And now, 19 of those homes sat squarely over the boundary. He traced the tree line against the county assessor's digital overlay. They didn't match. In fact, the new overlay had been filed only 8 months ago. The original deed lines had vanished from the public-facing records. His uncle's land had been wiped clean. Officially, it didn't exist anymore. Unofficially, it lived in family papers, handwritten agreements, and the calloused hands of men who knew how to draw borders with shovels and memory. He retrieved his laptop from the passenger seat and opened an old email, one from his uncle, sent 5 years back. It had a photo attachment, an overhead shot of the lot from a forestry survey. In it, the land was untouched, wild, and most importantly, whole. He dropped that image next to the drone shot, overlaid them, then froze. The new development's fencing cut 28 feet into his land. A full strip stolen with quiet confidence. It had taken them less than a year to erase a century. Shaq leaned back in the seat and let the moment settle. He knew what this was. Not just theft, not just arrogance. It was targeted erasure. The kind that didn't scream in your face. It wore khakis, smiled at ribbon cuttings, and used phrases like zoning easement and community integrity. He scrolled the drone camera over the sales sign planted just beyond the community entrance. Lock Ridge Homes from the 400s. Where tradition meets tomorrow. He took a screenshot. That's when it clicked. Locke. Not the name of a street. Not a coincidence. The developer was Cambria Locke. He remembered her from an old real estate profile, the first lady of Family First Housing, known for exclusive developments across the Southeast. Her press persona was spotless. Her real work was far more curated, whisper marketed through elite circles, closed invitation communities, and security-conscious buyers. And now she had quietly, surgically taken Shaq's family land and built homes for people who didn't even know where they were standing. He looked once more at the oak trees. Still standing. Still watching. The ridge shouldn't exist, but it did. And now, so would the truth. Cambria Locke never wore power like a weapon. She wore it like cashmere. Soft, silent, expensive. There was nothing outwardly aggressive about her presence. In a room she smiled first, nodded often, and listened more than she spoke. But behind the perfectly pressed navy suits, neutral lipstick, and soft pearls was a woman who had mastered the art of control, not by confrontation, but by curation. She built Locke Ridge the same way she built her reputation, meticulously without fingerprints. The paperwork was always clean. She never signed demolition orders directly. She never met with city councils herself. Everything flowed through buffers, assistant attorneys, zoning consultants, marketing heads. She could deny without lying that she'd ever heard the name of the families who once lived there. That was the thing about Cambria. She didn't make messes. She just made things disappear. Her development philosophy was simple. Clean community values. It wasn't written in neon, but it pulsed through every campaign. Clean meant predictable. Clean meant like-minded neighbors. Clean meant people who didn't disrupt harmony. And while nothing in her brochures mentioned race, religion, or income, the undertone didn't whisper. It hummed. The HOA bylaws at Locke Ridge were her finest work. 34 pages of regulation crafted to shape a neighborhood into a quiet fortress. There were no explicit bans, just occupancy stipulations. No more than one adult per bedroom, unless married. No renters allowed. Applicants must provide proof of dual income. Independent head of household applications. What the clause really meant was, no single mothers, especially not poor ones. It was technically legal, it was morally engineered, and it worked. Of the 96 homes built, 91 were already sold, all to white families, subtly marketed through exclusive real estate circles, quiet church networks, and private mailing lists. It didn't matter if it felt wrong. The numbers made it right, until someone noticed the trees. The oak line that cut across the far north boundary of the property didn't match the new topography maps filed by her office. But that wasn't Cambria's concern. She paid people to handle those details, like Lauren, her survey chief, who'd taken cash bonuses to clean the edges of boundary records. But the tree line meant something, and Cambria hadn't accounted for that, because the trees, gnarled, old and marked with iron nails, were boundary markers of a parcel that legally belonged to someone else. Not just someone. Shaquille O'Neal. She learned it in the least dramatic way. A letter from a city clerk, flagged for legal irregularity, landed on her desk. It mentioned parcel overlay conflict, ridge development in parcel 77B. She scanned it, uninterested, until she saw the name at the bottom. O'Neal Shaquille. At first she laughed, thought it was a mistake, thought it was another inflated celebrity name, buried in red tape. Then she called her lawyer. An hour later she wasn't laughing, because the truth started surfacing, slowly, but unstoppably. Parcel 77B wasn't just a minor clerical oversight. It was the northern stretch of Locke Ridge, 19 homes worth of land, and it had never legally left the O'Neal family trust. The land hadn't been sold. It had been absorbed, illegally, through a reclassification zone filed under an outdated urban renewal clause, one that dated back to 1963. The same clause used decades ago to push black communities out of promising lands under the guise of redevelopment. The clause had been dormant for years, until someone in Cambria's orbit revived it, knowing full well what it allowed. And now it had tied her name to one of the most egregious property misappropriations in Georgia's recent history. Cambria wasn't rattled, not at first. She had weathered controversy before. A lawsuit here, a zoning battle there. She simply made the right calls, offered the right settlements, and by the next news cycle, her name vanished. That was her specialty, vanish before the pitchforks show up. But this was different. Shaquille O'Neal wasn't just famous, he was respected. And worse, he wasn't loud. He didn't scream for attention. He moved quietly, strategically, and from what her lawyers were now telling her, he wasn't seeking publicity. He was gathering proof. Cambria responded. The only way she knew how. Denial through polish. She held a quiet press meet to emphasize Lockridge's legacy of unity. She released promotional videos featuring white and Latino families smiling in front of model homes. She announced a community blood drive, all misdirection. What she didn't know, what she never anticipated, was the name Arlen Trask. She hadn't recognized it when she'd seen it on a federal zoning audit request. Just another name on another form. But Arlen Trask wasn't another bureaucrat. He was the U.S. Attorney General, and he was Shaq's longtime friend. The tide was turning, and Cambria could feel it. Her inbox, usually filled with high-end brokers and hand-picked media contacts, now buzzed with internal legal alerts. Emails with subject lines like inquiry regarding bylaw violation, federal assessment pending, cease order threat. Her staff, once loyal to the core, started whispering, avoiding eye contact, printing and somewhere deep in her gut, Cambria knew. She had crossed a line she didn't understand. Not because the land was valuable, but because it was remembered. The family she'd erased didn't leave names on deeds, but they left them on trees. In letters, in the kind of paper that didn't go through government hands, but lived in glove boxes, Bibles and basement safes. Paper that meant something in a court bigger than the one she was used to. And Lockridge, it wasn't just a housing project anymore. It was evidence. The Queen of Order had made her empire on denial. But now, she'd built too far. Too fast. Too arrogantly. And justice, it was about to become visible in ink, in soil, and in memory that would not stay buried. Shaq didn't speak to the press. He didn't post anything online. Didn't hint at outrage. Didn't whisper a single public word about Lockridge. That wasn't his way. Not now. This wasn't about raising volume. It was about raising facts. So he got to work. Quietly. Systematically. His first stop was the county archives office in Macon. A dull beige building, with humming lights and a front desk that hadn't been updated since the 80s. He came alone, in sweats and a cap. Just another man looking for old maps. But what he found wasn't just dated, it was missing. Parcel 77B, the property line tied to his family's inheritance, had no recent public listing. The database showed a jump from 2017 to 2022 with no recorded transfers, no sale history, no zoning petitions. A 5-year blackout in a system that prided itself on continuity. It wasn't a glitch. It was a wipe. He took out his phone, snapped a photo of the screen, and moved on. He drove back to the old barn his uncle once used for storing equipment and paperwork. The barn now weather-worn, its wood faded silver, the lock rusted stiff. The key still sat beneath the fake rock by the well pump, just as his uncle had always kept it. Inside, the air was thick with dust and hay, but the far corner beneath the rafter marked 1973, held something covered in canvas and sealed with chains. Shaq pulled the cloth off slowly, revealing a cedar lockbox etched with their family's initials. O'Neill, Nelson, Landry, the line of 3 brothers who had owned the land since the early 1900s. The lock snapped open after a few minutes of quiet work with an old key from his uncle's keepsake ring. Inside was a manila envelope, handwritten in thick, firm strokes on the front. Land Trust Agreement, 1986. Do not destroy. Shaq sat back on the barn floor, letting the weight of the moment anchor him. This wasn't hearsay. It was documentation. The agreement was notarized, witnessed, and signed by every brother still living at the time, including his great-grandfather. It confirmed that Parcel 77B was to be held in trust for the O'Neill family line in perpetuity, with all development or sale subject to internal family vote. No vote had ever taken place. No sale had ever occurred. And yet Holmes now stood on it. Shaq didn't call his publicist. He didn't call his manager. He called Arlen Trask. They hadn't spoken in years, not formally, but Trask picked up on the second ring. A deep voice answered with a slight edge of familiarity. If this is about golf, I'm hanging up. Shaq didn't laugh. It's about land, he said. 2 hours later, Trask had a team combing the Georgia zoning archives remotely. Parcel 77B had been flagged, and then buried, using a reactivated clause from 1948, the Urban Redevelopment Zoning Exception Act. It was a holdover law originally passed during the rise of suburban sprawl, used back then to convert blighted neighborhoods, usually black and low income, into commercial or white residential zones. The clause had been dormant for decades, but someone had reactivated it, quietly, legally, and intentionally, to push through the Lockridge development. It's the perfect theft, Shaq's lawyer muttered when reviewing the files. No direct sale, no disclosure, no paper trail to chase. Just a loophole used at the right moment, by someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Cambria Locke. Trask didn't waste time. He wasn't one to tweet. He moved behind the curtain. He looped in 2 federal zoning analysts, a property fraud investigator, and a civil rights consultant from the DOJ. But no formal complaint was filed. Not yet. That wasn't the move. Not until the full scope was mapped. Meanwhile, Shaq launched his own form of investigation, hiring a topographic drone crew to survey the ridgeline from the air, marking every inch of boundary infringement. They matched it against the trust map from 1986, then against the federal aerial overlays used in environmental assessments. There was a 28-foot incursion, precisely where the luxury homes now sat. The drone footage was time-stamped, layered, watermarked. It wasn't speculation. It was structure on stolen ground. But Shaq still said nothing. He remembered something his mother once told him when he was young. Power isn't what you say, it's what they know you're holding, even when you haven't shown it. He was holding more than evidence now. He was holding memory. And memory, when recorded in soil and notarized ink, becomes proof. Cambria Locke didn't know yet. But the land did. Arlen Trask had seen the inside of too many rooms, where power played dress-up. Country clubs pretending to be boardrooms, gala halls masking corruption as charity, courtrooms polished to hide injustice in procedure. He had the kind of face that made billionaires uneasy, not because he threatened loudly, but because he never blinked when they did. He ran the U.S. Department of Justice like an old watch, quiet, relentless, and dangerously precise. So when Shaquille O'Neal sent a private request for an off-the-record meet in D.C., Arlen didn't ask why. He just cleared the hour. They met in an unremarkable glass room 3 floors beneath the DOJ's Public Integrity Division, the kind of room with no windows, and a table that had seen more confessions than coffee. Shaq laid the papers out in silence. No preamble. Just the documents. A notarized land trust agreement, dated 1986. A drone overlay showing boundary intrusion. A list of development markers stamped over federally protected soil, and a zoning clause reactivated from 1948. One directly tied to displacement statutes, written for urban renewal in the Jim Crow South. Arlen didn't speak for 3 minutes. Then he sat back in his chair, ran a finger along the spine of the file, and nodded once. That was the moment Lock Ridge became more than a property dispute. It became a federal timeline. He didn't ask for permission. He issued a single directive to his inner circle. Quiet trace. No public filings, no leaks, just connect every Shell LLC, subcontractor, environmental waiver, and city signature tied to Lock Ridge. The threads began to pull. One of the first names that surfaced wasn't even on the development permits. It was behind them. Silverland Equity Partners, a mid-tier funding group that had funneled over $8 million into the Lock Ridge build. On paper, they were clean. But in the footnotes of their holdings, a boutique property consultancy called Lock Living Concepts LLC. It was owned by a woman named Cambria Locke. Arlen flagged it in red. He knew how these people operated, not with open theft, but with buried names and off-site bank meetings. Always a lawyer or two between them, and liability. But he also knew something most of them didn't. The law remembers longer than ambition does. By day 4 of the trace, Arlen's team had a full network map. 9 LLCs feeding 1 holding company, 3 environmental sign-offs pushed through in under 48 hours, and 1 zoning override that bypassed a federal soil preservation report. It all led back to a decision signed off by Judge Harold M. Jaron. Jaron had never drawn suspicion before. Straight record. No ethics flags. But one analyst noticed something strange. A payment listed as legal research consulting, tied to a firm called Miraset West. It was a dummy office. But its vice president, Caroline Jaron, his daughter, a former real estate consultant, now working in what was registered as eco-legal analysis, the same category used to greenlight Lock Ridge's Phase 2 expansion. Arlen leaned over his agent's shoulder when the report came through, and said nothing, but he bookmarked the page. There were no phone calls made that night. No formal letters sent. Arlen believed in airtight cases, not press conferences. He'd seen careers implode not from misconduct, but from poor timing. So he let the case grow, silently. He reviewed Shaq's files again that night. Not in the office, but at home. over bourbon and soft jazz. His glasses perched low. One page stuck with him. A photocopy of a hand-drawn property sketch, with family land. Never sold. Scrawled across the bottom. It wasn't legal documentation, but it was proof of intent. And in federal cases, intent was gold. He knew what this was, the kind of crime that wore manners. Cambria Locke wouldn't be caught forging deeds. She'd hired the kind of people who found loopholes and manipulated old policy, who used legal architecture to do what mobs once did with torches. But Arlen didn't need her to confess. He just needed her cornered. By the end of week 1, DOJ field teams were already ghost-walking through Georgia records. The GBI had been looped in, unofficially. One agent embedded with the regional zoning office, another into the title insurance firm Cambria's buyers used. Still no headlines. Still no buzz. But every contractor she'd ever paid was now being watched. The judge who signed her override. He hadn't blinked when it came across his desk. But now his daughter's name was attached to 5 separate shell applications, all filed within 3 days of each other, all tied to federal land clauses, all filed under the same IP address. The kind of detail Cambria never expected anyone to notice. And still, Orlin didn't flinch. He was waiting. Not for her to panic, but for her to keep moving, because people like her didn't freeze when the ground cracked. They built faster. But now, every brick she laid, every home she sold, every file she sent, was a breadcrumb leading deeper into the thing she thought was buried. And Arlen? He didn't chase headlines. He chased ending. The letter arrived in a plain white envelope. No return address, no postage, hand-delivered to the security desk of Shaq's Atlanta office. The handwriting on the front, old, shaky, but deliberate, simply read, "For Mr. O'Neill's eyes only." Inside, folded neatly between yellowing sheets, were 2 things: a rolled blueprint, and a single-page letter written in ballpoint ink, shaky but unflinching. "My name is Silas Varnum. I was the municipal inspector for the Ridge 22 Development Corridor in 1985. I'm dying now. Stage 4. Liver. So this is what I've got left to do. Tell the truth before I run out of breath.
I was paid to ignore misfilings. I was paid not to walk the North Line, but I walked it anyway, and I marked it. What they've built. It's not just on your land, Mr. O'Neill. It's on protected soil."
Attached is the original topographic survey. I made a copy in secret. It shows where the boundary actually runs. They pushed it. 30 feet. Maybe more. The map he included was stunning, not just in its detail, but in what it exposed. The north boundary of Lock Ridge, cut clean through what was federally registered decades ago as Heritage Easement 12B, land designated for preservation, after a series of post-Jim Crow redevelopment pushes aimed at righting historical wrongs. The map showed old notations, hand-drawn trees, slope angles, stone markers, that lined up perfectly with the drone overlays Shaq had already gathered. For the first time, there was a direct bridge between memory and legislation. Shaq's land had been violated. But so had federal land. It wasn't just a civil theft anymore. It was a criminal breach of federal protection. And worse still, that stolen 30-foot strip now held 5 finished homes. Families were already living in them. Mortgages signed. Moving trucks long gone. These people didn't know. They weren't complicit. They were sold someone else's silence. Shaq read the letter twice. Then he drove 3 hours to the address listed on the map's edge, written faintly in the margin. Varnum Cabin, Old Mill Road, Ridge Post 3. It wasn't a cabin anymore. It was a hospice. Silas Varnum lay in a small room, with soft jazz humming from an old speaker, and sunlight slipping across a blanket draped over his legs. His eyes were pale, but sharp. When Shaq stepped inside, Silas didn't flinch. "I knew you'd come," the man said, voice rough like splintered wood. Shaq pulled a chair up beside him. "Didn't speak. Just listen." Silas coughed, then leaned his head back and spoke in fragments, each word pulled through effort. "They paid me $5,000 in 1985 dollars. Told me to look the other way on Ridge misalignment. It wasn't Cambria back then. It was her father. Same game though. Same name." Shaq's fingers tightened around the paper. "Your family's land was supposed to be left untouched. Same with that federal strip. After the 63 clearance zones, there was legislation. Quiet, not flashy. But that land was protected. Heritage program. People forget, but dirt doesn't." He paused to breathe. I kept that map in a toolbox for 40 years. Didn't matter. Until it did. Shaq left that room with more than evidence. He left with the voice of the land, spoken through a dying man's final act of decency. Back in Atlanta, his legal team began cross-referencing the survey with public construction plans. The difference was undeniable. The Lock Ridge development had not only trespassed, it had been built intentionally over a known preservation zone. The property files filed under Cambria Lock's firms showed selective edits, none of which acknowledged easement. The question wasn't if it was fraud, it was who knew, and how many people had signed to make it disappear. The implications were massive. 5 homes, sold to middle-class families, all white, all first-time buyers, now sat atop land that couldn't legally be sold. The titles were invalid, the foundations illegal, and the emotional weight, unbearable. These families didn't steal. They were misled. Now Shaq faced a dilemma. Pursue truth, and innocent people could lose their homes. Back off and the system that buried his legacy would remain untouched. He didn't speak publicly. Instead, he made a second call to Arlen Trask. This time he included the survey and the letter. Trask's voice didn't shift. This moves it to federal fraud. Shaq asked just one thing. Don't go after the buyers. Wouldn't be legal to. They're victims of a bigger lie. Within 48 hours, a quiet DOJ task force began preparing subpoenas. They didn't target families. They targeted those who signed off. Zoning commissioners, environmental consultants, legal signatories on the mortgage securities. And at the center of it all, Cambria Lock. Her defense was predictable. I had no knowledge of that zone's history. She made it in an email, CC'd to 10 executives, leaking conveniently to the press. But Silas's letter was time-stamped. The payment logs from her father's old company matched up, and the shell company that absorbed the land via transfer. It had been reactivated by Lock Holdings 2 years prior. Shaq never published the letter. He didn't need to, because now the dirt had spoken. And what Cambria built was already cracking. Shaq had long since learned that surface polish rarely reflected the ground it stood on. Lock Ridge looked clean, white picket fences, flawless lawns, a uniform stillness like it had been assembled from a template. But beauty, as he knew, could be built on rot. And now, with the landline boundary broken and Silas Varnum's deathbed letter in hand, he wanted to know everything that had been paved over. He hired Cassandra Blythe, a forensic urban analyst who had once helped expose a luxury waterfront development in Florida that was secretly built over a capped industrial dump. She was precise, unflinching, and more dangerous than most prosecutors, because she understood where cities buried their sins. Within a week, she and her team were collecting soil cores from areas surrounding the ridge, samples extracted just outside the development limits, where no permits had ever been pulled. She flagged inconsistencies within days. The soil under Lock Ridge didn't match environmental declarations filed by Cambria's firm. Lead content was unusually high. Phthalates, synthetic chemicals found in construction and industrial runoff, were present in quantities that didn't belong in a supposedly clean residential zone. But the most damning find came 12 feet beneath the model home at Lot. Buried there, beneath a pristine crawlspace and polished foundation, was a fractured steel drum. Inside were deteriorated textiles, soaked in chemical binders. The surrounding earth showed long-term exposure to toluene, a solvent banned for residential development since Cassandra's verdict was immediate. It's an unregistered disposal site, likely dating back to the 1970s. Either someone knew, or someone chose not to. The EPA was notified under sealed protocol. They launched a quiet inquiry, masking it as a routine audit. But within days, their field agents were combing the neighborhood with underground radar. No alarms were raised, no homes evacuated. But whispers started. Families noticed black sedans parked down the street, and Lock Ridge, so proud of its untouchable design, began to shiver at its edges. Shaq didn't speak. Again, he didn't need to. He simply let Cassandra and the EPA do what truth always does when handled by the right hands. It rises. The cracks weren't just in the earth. They were in Cambria Lock's empire. It began with an anonymous tip to a freelance journalist at the Ledger Review. The tip came with an email, one pulled from Lock Holdings' internal servers by a former executive assistant who'd been fired 6 months earlier for compliance non-alignment. The email was titled Screening Preference Considerations. It was from Cambria. It read, "Let's continue emphasizing clean applicants for first-wave occupancy, dual income preferred, no debt flags, preferably no children. We want homes to project upward mobility. Stability first. Looks matter. 3 sentences later, another line. Let's avoid any rehab buyers or transitional families. Clean Ridge is the message. The email hit the internet like fire on dry leaves. Clean applicants. No children preferred. Looks matter. It wasn't coded enough to be misunderstood. The dog whistles were air horns. Within hours, public outrage ignited. Social media tore through the document. Hashtags trending, lockout, clean for who, concrete lies. Civil rights groups seized on the revelations. Legal advocates began combing every Lockridge sale and mortgage for discriminatory screening patterns. One class action suit followed another. The EPA didn't have to hide anymore. They went public, confirming soil violations, unpermitted excavation, and potential health threats at multiple home sites. Cambria's defense was instant and robotic. I had no knowledge. She said it on a Thursday press call, eyes hollow behind polished makeup, the Lock Holdings logo standing awkwardly behind her like a wall trying to pretend it wasn't crumbling. But by then, her own signature had already been verified on a waiver request filed in 2019, one that sought limited environmental reclassification for Phase 2 of Lockridge development. It wasn't just oversight. It was willful ignorance, penned, stamped, and profit-driven. Parents living in those homes weren't waiting for court orders. Some began packing. One family, unaware their backyard stood above buried waste, had a 6-year-old with chronic headaches they'd chalked up to allergies. A local journalist quoted the mother, tears running down her face. "We saved everything to move here. We thought we were giving our daughter safety." Cambria vanished from the public eye. Her executive board released a limp statement, claiming she was on leave to cooperate with federal investigations. But insiders knew the truth. Her staff was jumping ship. Investors were divesting. The State Real Estate Commission had opened an ethics probe, and HUD had requested all housing documents connected to her developments across 3 counties. Back in the O'Neill legal office, Cassandra handed Shaq the EPA's preliminary report. "Full violation," she said. "This wasn't just racism or zoning theft. It's ecological fraud. They built on poison." Shaq looked down at the soil map, where red zones now glowed under the drone imagery, like bruises under skin. The land had memory, but it also had truth buried in its layers. And now, truth was surfacing. Concrete or not, because no matter how clean Lockridge looked from a drone, it had been built on rot. By the time Cambria Locke had vanished from press briefings, she'd already launched another kind of defense. Not in courtrooms, not on official letterhead, but in HOA Facebook groups. These were her strongholds. The digital cul-de-sacs where her ideas of order had always flourished. Clean fonts, polite language, but behind the suburban charm was coded manipulation. It started small. A comment in the Lockridge HOA community forum. Heard some disturbing things about people trying to buy in from outside. This place was meant for a certain kind of family. Just saying, watch your property values. No names. No overt claims. But it lit a match. More posts followed, each laced with genteel paranoia. "We worked hard to build something safe here. Not everyone shares our values. Would be a shame if developers changed the character of our neighborhood. Anyone else worried about the safety changes coming to Ridge?" And though the language avoided slurs, the meaning was sharp as glass. It wasn't about values. It was about color, about poverty, about making sure no one outside the approved mold got a key to their gates. Cambria didn't post these herself. She didn't need to. The usernames were generic. Jean K. Mom 4, Secure Ridge, Real Future 79, but the phrasing matched her tone, her doctrine, even some of her internal marketing slogans. What she didn't know. One of her quietest watchers in the group was a DOJ cyber analyst named Darian Wells, a digital forensics expert assigned by Arlen Trask weeks earlier. His job was to trace coded language campaigns and digital suppression tactics in housing cases. Cambria's Facebook fire wasn't random. It was strategy, and it was sloppy. Darian began capturing screenshots, not just of comments but of metadata behind them. He built a pattern profile, timestamps, IP trails, even recycled copy-paste language. And then he found the breach. A post from New Ridge Neighbor, timestamped 3:12 a.m., on a Thursday talking about the dangers of non-owner residents bringing instability. It wasn't just racist fear-mongering. It was a violation of federal fair housing promotion standards. The burner account was traced to a masked VPN, but the VPN server endpoint registered through a static device ID at Lock Holdings HQ, specifically a subnet used only by executive logins. Darian didn't need a warrant yet. This was digital observation, and Cambria had all but set the trap herself. He packaged the digital trail post-origins, device IDs, login overlaps, into a confidential packet for the DOJ's Fair Housing Task Unit. The posts kept coming, more emboldened now. Cambria, believing she was invisible behind her chorus of ghost users, encouraged HOA moderators to ban non-local influencers and those promoting social agendas. Several members, including a young black family who had moved into one of the few unsold homes, were quietly muted or kicked from the forum. It wasn't just dog whistles anymore. It was digital redlining. Then came the post that broke the dam. A private message from SecureRidge to a newly admitted HOA member. You should know, the property next to yours might be bought by them. Act fast, before values drop. The recipient, a white mother of two, didn't respond. She forwarded the message to a local journalist instead. Then she sent it again, to the DOJ email address she found online. Subject line: I think our HOA is broken. That message reached Darian within the hour. It was the final piece he needed. Because what Cambria hadn't realized was that in her effort to preserve a community, she had created a digital trail of housing discrimination, direct enough to trigger federal jurisdiction. The burner account she used had recycled login times that matched her daily calendar, and security logs from her building matched Wi-Fi access points from those same timestamps. Darian's report landed on Arlen Trask's desk that Friday. 3 printed words at the top: pattern confirmed, coordinated digital discrimination. By Monday, the DOJ filed a motion for digital discovery on Lock Holdings' internal servers. Cambria's attempt to maintain control through whispers had become admissible evidence. What she had mistaken for subtlety, the law had named intent. The fire she'd sparked in Facebook groups wasn't just social division. It was federal interference. And now every just saying, every watch your values, had turned to smoke. The sun hadn't fully risen when the first sedan pulled into Lock Ridge. Black, low profile, federal plates. Then another, then 4 more. They didn't come with sirens. They came with briefcases, quiet voices, and sealed envelopes, the kind with gold DOJ seals and names printed in all caps. Residents opened their curtains to a scene that didn't match the morning calm. Agents and Navy winebreakers were already at the doors of the Lock Holdings sales office. 2 at the HOA community building. Another team entering the Central Records trailer at the edge of the cul-de-sac Cambria once called the future of suburban stability. Subpoenas. Issued overnight. Executed at dawn. By 7:10 a.m., the Lock Ridge server room was cut off. By 7:34, hard drives were being photographed, bagged and logged by federal forensics. Every digital device with access to HOA records, zoning files, and construction specs. The residents stood in driveways, coffee in hand, bathrobes tight, trying to understand what was unfolding in front of them. Most had no idea what Cambria Lock had buried, but some had started to suspect. Inside one of the model homes, a former junior project manager, fired months ago for refusing to forge timestamps, handed over a folder of internal emails. Attached were annotated PDFs, showing altered zoning renderings. At the top of one page, remove Ridge School line for final drafts. The agent took the folder, eyes narrowing at the phrase, Ridge School. There hadn't been a school listed on any of the updated maps for that area. Not even historical overlays had included a reference. But one person had heard of it. Shaq. When the DOJ team called to request context, he didn't hesitate. It was a school for black students, he said. Demolished during '63 renewal. The land was never returned. We were told it didn't matter anymore. Cambria Lock had erased the Ridge School, not just from maps but from memory, built over the land. And now that land was whispering again. The subpoenas swept wider as the morning burned on. Federal agents began interviewing current and former contractors. Most of the original engineers kept quiet. But one, a retired electrical subcontractor named Jerome Briggs, turned quickly when he saw the subpoena. He opened his garage and handed over a phone he'd kept out of fear. There's a voice memo on here, he said. Didn't know if it was anything, but I recorded it, just in case. Phone's screen was cracked. The memo was labeled only, Ridge. When played, the voice was unmistakable. Cambria Lock. Calm. Sharp. Dangerous. I don't care if he played basketball for a living. If he wants to make this a legacy issue, Then I'll bury it the same way we buried the Ridge School. We crush this now, or he'll take everything. There was a pause. Another voice. Quieter, male. You really want to push back against him? Then Cambria again. He's sentimental. That's all. That kind forgets. We erase, we build, we move on. Just like always. The audio was clean. No ambiguity. No distortion.
Intense. On record.
Federal intent. By midday, every contractor tied to Lock Ridge's fast build phase was either flipping or hiding. At least 3 anonymous tip lines reported documentation dumps, files shredded behind the HOA office, hard drives removed from real estate branches. One report of blueprints burned in a fire barrel behind Cambria's second development site. But the feds had already seen enough. From one HOA board member came another revelation. A hidden subfolder in their community communication system labeled Legacy Talks. Inside were Cambria's directives for narrative management, including community talking points discouraging unverified black claims about heritage or old boundary lines. The wording was clinical, sterile, racist in its exactness. Cambria had coached her community on how to invalidate truth, but it wasn't working anymore. What Lock Ridge had tried to build as a haven of order was now scattered across courtrooms, inboxes, and evidence lockers. And what it tried to forget, the Ridge School, the soil beneath the polished concrete, the families erased for cleaner futures, had come back. Shaq stood on the edge of the original property line that morning, watching the sedans roll in, watching Lock Ridge finally unravel. He didn't need to walk inside. He'd already been there. Before any of them. In memory. In bloodlines. In stories told on porches by uncles who never left Georgia even when their deeds did. He looked toward the north fence line where the school once stood, and said quietly, "You didn't bury it. You just paved over it." The earth hadn't forgotten. And now neither would anyone else. The house was gone. Leveled like it had never stood. Paved over by Phase 3 of Lock Ridge's family-friendly corridor. But before the final demolition, a preservationist from the Georgia Historical Coalition had flagged it. She'd found a faint architectural outline beneath the new construction blueprints. It didn't match anything in the updated designs. That outline marked where Shaq's great-grandfather's home had once stood, the last standing structure from the original O'Neill landholding. It was nothing but cracked slab now. But history, like memory, doesn't disappear. It embeds itself in the bones of places. A crew of EPA investigators and federal preservation officers returned to that site during the subpoena sweep. They weren't there for evidence of zoning fraud or pollution this time. They were looking for truth, and they found it not in the dirt, but behind the wall of a partially standing chimney, the last untouched section of the original house's inner structure. Someone decades ago had sealed off a cavity behind the hearth bricks. Inside, packed tight with straw insulation and tin foil, was a rolled oilskin wrap. The preservationist unsealed it with gloves. 3 documents were inside. The first, a 1960 property deed, signed, stamped, and authenticated, declaring that the O'Neill land, including what later became Lock Ridge's northern ridge, was held in reserve status with restricted development rights. The purpose? Designated future educational use for families displaced by regional integration laws. The second, a charter, a community agreement, co-signed by local black ministers and 3 civic leaders from the era. It declared the Ridge as a place for learning, community, and rebuilding what was taken. That meant the Ridge School wasn't just a school. It was a covenant, a response to erasure. The third document was the school blueprint itself, hand-drawn in incredible detail, with notes from the architect, a black veteran named Reginald Otis, who'd returned from Korea and pledged his skills to building a future where black children wouldn't be taught from leftovers. That future never came. The charter was never honored. The land was rezoned, bought in pieces, gentrified before gentrification had a name, and now it was luxury real estate. Until this discovery, the documents were authenticated within 48 hours. The Department of Justice, now deep into its full civil rights probe of Lock Holdings, issued a new classification on the land, Educational Reparative Zone. Cambria Lock, who had tried to pave legacy into silence, had not only built on stolen land, but on federally promised reparations. That alone shifted the scope of the investigation from housing fraud to historical displacement violation, a category not pursued often, but one with precedent and teeth. Shaq sat with the documents quietly when they were handed to him. He didn't say much, just read each one slowly, lips pressed in thought. He wasn't angry. He was anchored. because all this time he'd only wanted restoration, not demolition. The day after the discovery, he met with the DOJ team at the edge of Lock Ridge, where Phase 3 homes were still unfinished. He asked just one thing. "Don't tear down the homes," he said. "They're not the problem. The memory is." Arlen Trask listened, arms folded, silent. "I don't want concrete justice," Shaq said. "I want a school, a real one, built on what was promised." He didn't flinch when he said it. He didn't ask for permission. The DOJ agreed. They drafted a settlement plan in partnership with the Georgia Department of Education and the U.S. Civil Rights Division. The 5 homes closest to the northern ridge would be bought out at market value. The families offered new homes, full relocation support, and lifetime exemption from mortgage tax on their next properties. Those 5 homes would be removed, but not destroyed. They would be replaced by the O'Neill Ridge School, a public institution built from the charter's original blueprint, updated with trauma-informed design, inclusive access points, and a mission statement pulled from Reginald Otis's notes. "We do not inherit silence. We grow futures from it." Cambria Locke's silence was deafening during the announcement. She issued a one-line statement through her attorney. No comment at this time, but it didn't matter. The blueprint had spoken louder than her empire ever did. Shaq stood on the slab of his great-grandfather's chimney that evening, the sun low, the heat soft, the press at a distance. He didn't speak to them. He didn't need to. He was standing on a map that had never been meant to be lost. And now, it was home again. By the time the Ridge Equity Trust was announced, Lock Ridge had already changed shape. It no longer looked like the gated kingdom Cambria Locke had once envisioned. The walls hadn't crumbled in chaos. They'd been disassembled with legal care, like stitches removed from a wound, ready to breathe. The 5 homes that sat most egregiously over stolen and protected soil were removed, not with bulldozers, but with respect. Their owners had been compensated generously, and offered new homes elsewhere, free from the lies their mortgages were built upon. They left without bitterness, because now they understood what they'd been standing on. The rest of the neighborhood? It remained, but its name was gone. Lock Ridge had no HOA anymore. No clean applicant guidelines. No secret forums. The land titles were reassigned through a new structure, one crafted by a team of civil rights attorneys, community organizers, and one silent co-founder, whose name didn't appear on the board. Shaq called it the Ridge Equity Trust. It was simple in design, bold in impact. Homes would now be available to single-parent families, to renters, to low-income buyers, to people who had, for generations, been priced out of what their grandparents had once owned. Each new resident received not just a deed, but a letter. A personal letter, written in Shaq's handwriting. Each one unique. "This land was taken before. It won't be again. Welcome home." Cambria Locke? She'd fought quietly behind the scenes, trying to preserve what reputation she had left. But the weight of evidence, digital trails, zoning fraud, and EPA findings couldn't be buried beneath charm or lobbying. The state revoked her real estate license. Her holding companies collapsed. Investors pulled out. By the time her legal counsel attempted a plea for legacy preservation, the judges laughed behind closed doors. There would be no legacy for Cambria Locke. No streets named after her. No parks funded by her. Her name faded not because she was torn down, but because what she built had no roots. The land no longer whispered of loss. It began to speak of something else. The first tree planted under the trust wasn't ornamental. It was an oak sourced from a nearby forest that once bordered the original Ridge School. It was lifted carefully by local volunteers and teens from a nearby youth program, then carried onto the cleared earth where the 5 homes had stood. No cameras, just people. And Shaq standing beside them, sleeves rolled, boots in the dirt. He didn't speak. He never did. He held the trunk steady while it was lowered into place, packed the soil with his hands, nodded once when it was done. Next to the tree, a hand-carved sign was planted. It didn't mention lawsuits or victories or headlines. It didn't name names, but it told the truth in the way only legacy could. Some fences were never meant to stand, so we grew something that will. It became more than a tree. It became a marker of resistance, of healing, of memory honored. Weeks passed, then months. The Ridge Equity Trust began construction on the O'Neill Ridge School, using the original charter, honoring the 1960 deed, built by hands that knew why it mattered. The classrooms weren't just spaces, they were stories. One hall was named after Silas Farnham, another after Reginald Otis. In the main entrance, a mural of a young girl reaching towards sky-colored roots stretched across the ceiling. No mention of basketball, just history. Reclaimed. Shaq refused interviews, declined awards, turned down a commemorative statue. "This isn't about me," he said once, to a local journalist who caught him during a supply drop at the construction site. "This is about dirt that remembered when people didn't." He kept coming back, quietly, not to supervise, to see, to make sure the kids playing in the garden understood the ground beneath them, that it had been stolen, reclaimed, respected. One day, a boy stopped him near the new library wing. "You really own this place?" he asked. Shaq laughed. "Nah. The people do. I just helped dig." The boy blinked. "But you're Big Shaq." "I'm just Shaq here," he replied, smiling. "Big things grow when we don't need to be the biggest thing in the story." That was the point. Always had been. Not revenge. Not noise. Legacy. And so the land that once bore secrets now bore signs of something new. Equity. It wasn't perfect, but it was planted, and every root knew who it was growing for. This isn't just a story about stolen land. It's about what we choose to build when no one's watching. If this shook something in you, ask what's beneath your neighborhood. Question who drew your lines. Remember, justice doesn't rest in courtrooms. It lives in the soil, the silence, the stories we refuse to forget. Dig deeper. It's your turn now.